This week on Eco Show, we have information about giant kelp, some basic background on that. We have some research about the impact of pesticides on soil creatures. We also have some news that will be covering world record heat waves and heat impacts around the world, some records that have been passed this past week. We'll also have some info on Spain and their efforts to be more sustainable in their energy practices. And we'll get to see the tallest tree in the world and some bison roaming free. This is Eco Show. Hello and welcome to Eco Show. This is a show about ecology, the environment, news, and happenings in that space in general. I go through an animal or plant or something of the week just to get us started with some interesting information. And then we talk about some recent ecology research and wrap up with some news about the environment and the world that's been going on. This week, our thing of the week is giant kelp. And the genus name for this is Macrocystis. And the macro means big, and cystis is talking about these little air bladders that are on giant kelp. So if you've seen kelp before, it can grow in these really long columns, and it's buoyed up by bladders, by these little bladders. Each one of those lives for about 3 years, these giant kelp, and they may grow up to 45 meters, which is 150 feet, at a rate of 60 centimeters or 2 feet per day. So they can get very tall and they grow very fast. So we have a nice photo here of a kelp forest, which really is a forest. It has so much going on. They're usually teeming with life. They're providing food for the area, for little creatures in the zone, and refuge as well from currents and changing temperatures. Interestingly enough, giant kelp, is not a plant. It's actually an algae. And what algae are, we talked about algal blooms last week, and it's essentially a photosynthetic and eukaryotic organism. So that means it has a nucleus in it. Eukaryotic, that's what it means. But these are the specific sort of thing that they are is really sort of strange. So if you're interested in a deep dive into it's not a plant, but into the morphology of things, what makes kelp a kelp is a little bit over my head for me to be able to explain this, but it's basically an algae, which means it photosynthesizes, so it takes the sun to get its energy, and it uses carbon dioxide as well, and then produces oxygen. In order to hold to the base of the ocean floor, it uses a holdfast, which looks like a big knot that it will attach to the bottom of the water, and it's not a root. And the blades at the very bottom of these kelp forests, of a kelp plant, well, I can't say kelp plant, kelp algae, I'm probably going to say kelp plant, or no, I won't say kelp plant. I gotta stick to the real thing. Anyway, so the bottom blades of kelp are sort of like a fern. If you've seen a fern before, they have these long fronds and they have these lots of little spores at the bottom of them, and those spores drop off, and those are essentially the sort of like seeds. So the bottom of kelp have little spores that are dropped off. The spores then will float around and then reattach on the bottom of seafloor someplace else and grow into a nice big kelp. So we have a little photo here of a kelp plant with this holdfast, which is the matted bit of things there. And I'm looking at the fronds. I can't particularly see in this photo any sort of spores or anything like that, but you can see next to this big matted thing, you can see a small little fresh kelp plant growing there. So kelp are used industrially. The alginates are taken from them, and that's sort of used as a thickener. Kelp is also eaten in lots of places, and it's got nice minerals like iron and potassium. In terms of the ecology, they can be found around the world, a lot in the Pacific. So on the eastern Pacific coast, which the east of the Pacific is the west of the U.S. So around the Pacific Northwest in the U.S., all the way down to Mexico, and then from Peru down to Argentina, they can be found as well. Can also be found in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and sub-Antarctic islands, these giant kelp. So they are pretty well distributed in these sort of coastal areas around the world. The big impacts to them can be pollution, can poison them. That particularly happens in the Pacific Northwest. Also, warm water is not preferable for them to grow in. So you can see by the range of where they grow, they sort of stop around the warm tropical sort of regions and grow outside of those. So they're not too big a fan of warm water. And another thing that happens with warm water is that it increases the growth of sea urchins, which are usually purple spiny fellas that'll crawl around and will eat the kelp. So they like warmer water. So warm water can be kind of a bad cycle for kelp. And in some cases, when predators of kelp have been brought back, it's been beneficial. Predators of urchins have been brought back. It's been beneficial for kelp. So there's a particularly well-known example of this where otters were hunted for their pelts and things out in the western U.S. And they were knocked down. A lot of them were killed, and these sea otters eat sea urchins, and the loss of them, along with different climate change related things, led to urchins spreading and then eating kelp. But as sea otter populations have been recovering, the populations of giant kelp coming back has done pretty well. So they're a crucial part of this sort of cycle. And this is a important thing to understand, because these kelp forests are refuges for such a specific, it's like a rainforest habitat almost in the water. So there are places that are particularly in danger of these changes, and particularly the climate changes that are making the water warmer. And this is happening in Tasmania in a big way as well, where they've had a big issue with loss of kelp and people were wondering for a while if it was related to the harvesting of the kelp because they were harvested intensely for different products, like we mentioned before. But lately, it's more as a combination of these increased warm temperatures and little urchins and things being able to get around and chewing on them. And I'm gonna go back to that photo of the holdfast that I put up before because we might not have noticed, but you can see all around the bottom of this holdfast are a bunch of purple urchins. So those were snuck in there, nice and sneakily. So that's our thing of the week, giant kelp. Feels like there's more to say about that, and I'm sure there is. So I'll probably come back to them sometime. Maybe talk about kelp forest habitat, what lives in there. I'm also wondering what it is how do they get the air? What's the air in those little ballast things? So those are some good questions that just popped into my mind now, and I'll look them up at some point. Or you can put them in the comments below. Okay, on to research. And I'm putting the hand back up as an indicator to myself at what time point the research is. And the research is now. Okay, so our research this week is looking at the pesticide. Well, the title of it is Pesticide Effects on Soil Fauna Communities, a meta-analysis. This is by Léa Baumel and Léa Tisson et al. This was published in the 7th of June, 2023. So this was a very recent published thing in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And fauna just means creatures, basically. It can be insects or anything. And a meta-analysis, as we've talked about before, is an analysis of many studies. So they were looking to see what the impacts of pesticides on creatures, so insects mostly, but also of microbe communities under soil, how they're being impacted by pesticides. They're looking at all the different studies, or a lot of studies, that are looking at that to draw conclusions about this. And so why is it important to do this? It's important because there's a huge amount of biodiversity on Earth that comes from the soil fauna. It's also a very important ecosystem role. It sequesters carbon. It recycles nutrients, which just means there's, decomposition happening and things like that. And they're saying that there hasn't been a synthesis of the impacts of pesticides on soil fauna before. Results that they found were that there was decreased abundance and diversity of soil fauna. There was a bigger impact in particular on diversity of soil fauna than on abundance. So these pesticides decreased the overall number of fauna, and they decreased the variety of fauna that are hanging about, rolling in the dirt. These bad impacts there are bad impacts that they're saying are happening from these pesticides. Also, what happens that is an issue, I'm going slow because I'm trying to understand my notes. I put them in bullet points, and sometimes I've written stuff down and then I paste it and I don't know quite what I was meaning to say. I know I meant something at the time, but right now it is not processing in my head. An interesting thing that they found from looking at across all these different studies is that there is no dampening impact of pesticides over the time. So it's not like you put in the pesticides and then the number and diversity of species goes down and then they come back. So what they're saying is that as long as you're using pesticides, the impacts are continuing over time. It doesn't start to rebound or anything like that. They're saying that there's a big impact on these fauna communities, even at recommended dosages of these insecticide uses. And oftentimes these are used in tandem with one another because you'll have different things growing around the season. So you may be putting different pesticides down throughout the year. Some implications are that what they're finding is that there's significant detrimental non-target effect on soil biodiversity, which means that there's a large impact on species that aren't being focused on. So if you're trying to get rid of some sort of mite or scale or something like that from your plants and you're using insecticides, there's a broad scale impact that's going on beyond just what you're focusing on. The important the issue becomes when I write a note that's too long for me to process in my head, and then it needs to be a certain length so I can see it. But if I have to read it, then that messes me up. Anywho, yeah, and like we mentioned, when you're using several different pesticides throughout the year, that has a big impact on these little bugs. Their big point is that future use should be regulated based on evidence of impact. So the use of these insecticides so far has been done in such a way that it is really overlapping and impacting a lot of biodiversity in different ways. And there are some efforts going on to change the way that pesticides are being used. And it's sort of the outcomes of this study are what you expect, is that when you use a lot of pesticides, it would seem obvious that that's going to impact a lot of different bugs in the ground. But pretty cool to have this research done that's showing across studies that pesticides have these negative impacts, and that's important to be aware for your bumblebees and other creatures. So that's our research this week. There's a curse of the research section. I thought this was going to be simple, and I think it was. I think hopefully everyone grasped the research section. What I always say is that if the research section doesn't make sense to you, it's pretty much 99% my fault, because it means I haven't described it well. And I think we described that one okay. It's pretty simple. Basically, pesticides have an impact on bugs living below the ground, more so than what people may have previously expected. So hopefully there's some better understandings going on. It's tricky. We're having all this information of the impact that we're having on the world, and it's important to be able to digest that information, and it can feel overwhelming because we have such good technology for seeing everything that we're doing wrong. But in order to do things right, we have to change things in a pretty deep and meaningful way. So to be able to get to a point where we can actually do that, it's really important to digest these things. Anywho, now we're on to the news for today. And we had the world's hottest day ever. So I don't usually like going into negative news, but it's a pretty big thing. So you can't just ignore that this is happening. This is the world's hottest day ever recorded with modern technology, I think since the 1800s. And the 3rd of July was the hottest average day at just over 17 degrees Celsius, which is about the high 60s. It's maybe about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And the explanations for why this happened in particular are because climate change is making the world on average much warmer, but also because of this El Nino that we're in, which we've talked about in an earlier episode. And El Nino is a weather phenomenon that happens over time, sort of a bit sporadically, but we're currently in this El Nino period, which is a warm period. The water in the Pacific Ocean is very warm, which is leading to everything getting cooked up a bit warmer. So that is why we've got this hot day, and people are expecting that more records will be broken in the coming months. I originally saw this article in the BBC, so they had some impacts that were UK related, which I'm sure were also happening around the world in other places, but in particular, the UK had its hottest June just before this world's hottest day, and there were many fish kills that happened during this time, so mass die-offs of fish, which can happen for lots of reasons, but warm water can make it too unsafe for fish. It can also impact the balance of oxygen in the water that they need to breathe. An interesting thing they pointed out that I hadn't thought of before was that in these hot weather periods, you'll have flowers wilt and essentially die. And this means less food for bees and butterflies. So you see a wilting flower, or if you pick a flower or anything like that, I hadn't thought before of the impact down the food web that has. So they're pointing out that this is particularly bad for bees and butterflies, which I imagine has a kind of circular effect where if you have hot weather that kills the flowers, and then you have less food for the bees and butterflies, then less bees and butterflies are going to survive, and they'll be able to then pollinate less flowers. But some things you can do, and in particularly hot weather, if you know it's going to be hotter than usual for the area that you're living in, so you can put out bowls of water for birds and other creatures. Just maybe change the water out so you don't have a little mosquito den a brewing. And actually not cutting your grass can sometimes be helpful for small insects and things like that, because it provides them with habitat and refuge from heat. So leave out some water and don't cut your grass, please, if it's a hot day out. Okay, that's the doom and gloom news. I don't like talking about, you don't want to talk about it, but you gotta, some of the stuff you have to acknowledge it, and then we can have some, things that we can do about it. But Spain, so now to some good climate related news, is that Spain has generated 50% of its power from renewables in 2023. Portugal has reached 100%, and 103% of their energy consumption was with renewables. These countries are still using petrol and things like that, but the renewable things are helping for energy sources. An thing that was noted, I got to cut down on the use of the word interesting. In Portugal, in the month, I think it was June, where they produced 103% of their energy consumption. In the same month last year, they only produced 6% of their energy with renewables because they're in a drought, which impacts hydroelectric power. So these things are, kind of a little bit tenuous sometimes. Anyway, Spain was using solar, wind, and hydro to generate all of that power from renewables. And Germany has been at 52% of their energy from renewables in the first 6 months. There's some debate about whether or not nuclear should count as renewables. And when you're making such nasty waste from nuclear, I know we kind of have to use it, but it doesn't feel good in some ways as well. So that's another interesting thing. So let me know, do you think nuclear is renewable? That's some climate news, and now some kind of random ecology news. We have the tallest tree in Asia has been found. It's a Himalayan cypress. The species name is Cupressus torulosa. That wasn't a very good Latin accent, but it is 335 feet tall, or 102 meters tall. And for reference, that is the second biggest tree in the world. I think the tallest tree is about 380 feet, and that is a redwood that's in California. The way that they found this was pretty cool. They took a drone out into the forest, and they threw the drone up in the air and used LiDAR, which is a type of imaging that they can take from the drone that uses lasers. And they were able to scrub away all the leaves from the canopy from the forest to measure the size of chunks. And that's how they found the size of this tree. So we have one long photo that I'll squeeze in here that doesn't give a great reference for how big this tree is, but got to give respect to the tree. So we're going to show the whole tree. And then we've got a photo here of the side of the mountain in the Himalayas, which is, and you can see sort of a grove of these tall cypress trees. That's about that on that. And our last little bit of news is that there's been a long-term project to release 30 wild bison in Blackfoot Nation land. And their name for bison is Ini, Iinnii. This land, there will be no gates on it, so it will be particularly special for the bison, because oftentimes they're placed in areas where they have got to put up against gates eventually. So this will be a pretty special place for them. And we have a little photo here, or a little short video showing them being released onto this land. So we'll wrap up with that today, is this little photo. We have some bison running out onto the space. And they are going out and trotting out to the world. There we go. Okay, so we'll wrap up with that for today. So I hope your heart is a wild buffalo getting released into some unfenced land. And we'll catch you all next time. Have a great week. Thanks for catching in, for checking in and catching up. And we'll catch you on. Thank you. Bye.